Welcome to a 5-minute presentation on what Gary Thomas calls sacred pathways. This particular presentation is going to focus on just one pathway, the pathway of nature. A sacred pathway is a well-worn path in your life that very often leads you to an encounter with God. Past experiences of communion with God in those environments get embedded deep in your heart so that your awareness of God is heightened and anticipated whenever you travel that pathway. This presentation will focus on the power of nature to reveal many of God's attributes in personal and experiential ways to deepen your relationship with God. Jesus mastered all 9 of the pathways that Gary talks about, and he used them to express his love, awe, worship, and devotion to his Father when he was in times of deep communion, but few of us will have mastered all the pathways. You may find that 2 or 3 of the pathways are well worn and easy to navigate, while you recognize a couple more of the pathways as ones that have occasionally led you into the presence of God, but the path is not well worn quite yet. The good news is that frequent travel on a pathway will build a reservoir of memories that will embed deep within, so that in time that pathway will become familiar and your inner processes will focus easily on the voice of God speaking to you rather than be distracted by the mechanics of navigating that pathway. You also will probably find that 1 or more of the pathways are so new to you that you can't even imagine that they can lead you closer to God, because you might associate negative reactions with that pathway or be so distracted with finding your way that you find it hard to concentrate on God. I encourage you to come along for the journey as we work through each pathway as a church for 3 reasons. First, it is easier to appreciate an unfamiliar pathway when you are being guided and have company. Secondly, it can help you to understand and appreciate the worship styles of others that maybe you haven't been able to comprehend before. And thirdly, it is good to be able to hear God in all environments so that you hear all that He has to say to you rather than only hearing parts of the conversation that He is having with you. It is okay if you have 3 or 4 well-worn pathways that you deeply enjoy, while other pathways take more work and concentration to be productive. That's to be expected, and many factors have led to how you listen to God at this point in your life. But I believe God is calling each of us to learn to listen to His voice in every environment. So you might spend most of your time in the familiar paths, but travel the less worn paths once or twice a month to keep them passable, and then break trail on any pathways that are new to you whenever you can, so that you can hear God at all times because you are listening. The advice of Eli to his young protege Samuel is helpful when he experienced God in a new environment. Take a moment and take the posture in your heart of the words Eli taught Samuel to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Nature reveals to us a great deal about God. Whenever a person creates something, they reveal a great deal about themselves. It is often a deeply vulnerable moment when you share something with others that you've created, because now others have a window into your soul that has the curtains pulled away and the view is unobstructed. That's why sculptors and painters often veil their work until it is finished. It is why contractors stage a time for the customer that is called a reveal. It is why most of us sing unreservedly in the shower and more timidly in church, because it takes a lot of confidence to unreservedly reveal what we create. Songwriter Larry Norman expresses this idea when he refers to a performance as a time when I passed myself around to the crowd. It takes a lot of confidence to reveal to another what is deepest inside. God has revealed a lot by giving us access to His creation. As we pay attention to the world we live in as coming from the creative mind of God, we get to know Him in ways that aren't available in any other pathway. We don't simply hear about God or build theoretical models of His character, but we see Him at work. We aren't interacting with second-party gossip, but are experientially involved in seeing and hearing God up close and personal. To illustrate how this works, let me take you back to my first memory of snow. I grew up in Nigeria, where to my knowledge it has never snowed. I can remember listening to my mom and dad give me descriptions of snow and many of those stories about large snowstorms, and that gave me some level of understanding of something that I'd never experienced, even though I had asked myriads of questions. But when I first experienced snow falling down from the sky, many of my misconceptions were broken and replaced with more accuracy. Well, my older brother probably hadn't helped much, as he, when mom and dad weren't around, would tell me about how cold snow is and the danger of frostbite, or being buried alive in a blanket of 6 or 8 feet of snow and the prospect of dying because you're unable to move and no one can find you. I was 6 when I remember first seeing snow, visiting several aunts and uncles and numerous cousins in northern Ontario at the old Thompson homestead. 180 acres that had been parceled out in smaller sections from my grandfather to his 7 children. The cousins had gathered to meet these 2 cousins from Africa, and while mom and dad were visiting with the other adults, the younger crowd was roaming the back 80 acres when the wind blew in a small snow squall from Lake Superior. I began to panic as I envisioned the temperature dropping to -40 and snow piling up at a rate of 6 inches each minute, and I began to panic because I knew it was more than a 10-minute walk back to the house where mom and dad were and where it was warm. No one else seemed worried, least of all my brother, so I tried to stay calm, but my brother noticed my anxiety, and he saw a chance for him to take advantage of my incomplete knowledge of snow. He whispered to several other cousins, and they giggled amongst themselves as they made the appearance of helping me out by leading me on a path that was supposed to lead us home, but actually was taking us further away into a neighbor's property. As time passed and no buildings came into sight, I felt more and more anxiety until I was nearly hyperventilating. One of the older girls, one of the other cousins, ended the charade by loaning me her jacket and offering to take me home as we turned on the path and went the opposite way back home. As we walked, she asked me questions and explained that it wasn't likely that this snow squall would accumulate any depth on the ground as it was the first snow. She also told me that it would take months before the snow accumulation would reach 8 feet, and that -40 was only likely in January through March and not in October. I wasn't sure if I could believe her, as my brother's stories had burned deeply in my mind, so we returned to the house, and over the next few months I experientially learned that she was right. When we returned back to Nigeria, it was quite a while before I experienced snow again when I was 16. My reaction this time wasn't fear because of the various experiences I could remember from 10 years ago. And I knew that snow was not as dangerous as I had been led to believe, and I knew that one could actually have fun with snow. My first couple of weeks of seeing snow as a 16-year-old were very different. I was fascinated with a whole new world that I had little experience with. I could watch snow fall for hours. I was not bored in any way because I saw something that I'd never seen before. I'd go outside and I would collect snowflakes and see the different types of snow. I threw snowballs incessantly. I tobogganed down hills and trudged joyfully up the hills so that I could glide down again. I even volunteered to shovel snow because it was so new. And it was that kind of experience that I remember now as I think about how creation can teach us about God. If we're paying attention when we're out in nature, very often we begin to see how nature reveals many things about God. We often are very much impacted by the immensity of what we see and the power that it must have taken to create these huge things and very powerful things that we might be experiencing, such as the mountains or the water that flows. And yet we also can look and see with precision those really small things that God has created, the intricacy that is so beautiful and wonderful. But we can also see that while we're in nature, there's balance. Things work together. They are systems that give in some ways to each other, and they all work at the right time, in the right place. And it's absolutely amazing, which leads us to understand that what God creates is incredibly complex, and yet it continually works together with an integrity that is never compromised. We might notice an incredible beauty that is lavish. We see flowers, we see sunsets that very few people ever really enjoy and notice. But we also see things that are functional and beautiful at the same time, which is different than what we experience in everyday life. Even though there's vast diversity in creation, it all is working together. There's no war. Essentially, in creation, it works together in unity. Often as we take a look, we see the joy of animals loving springtime. We see things that are light, even though they might be incredibly profound, they aren't dull and heavy in that sense. And we often can see the incredible humor that God must have in the way that He's created lots of things in this natural world. It is easy in today's world, especially in northern Alberta, to live in a man-made bubble where we spend more time in our houses, cars, shops, stores, and other man-made environments where we are comfortable than anywhere else or than in creation. And we can think that we sometimes can control most of the things that we encounter. God can become one other element that we try to control, just like all the other elements in a man-made environment. Stepping into a natural environment can be scary for some people because they come face to face with many things that they cannot control. It can correct our propensity to think that we are the center of the universe and give us a more accurate perception. We learn that the wind, the temperature, the sun, the rain or snow, the water around us cannot ultimately be controlled by us. They were created by a person much bigger than any of these forces and therefore is far greater than any of us. It can force us into a posture of humility before God. In that posture of humility, we learn to overcome our fears and vulnerability and start to see what nature reveals about God. In nature, if you can relax, the outcome often becomes very positive. Naturalists not only appreciate the beauty and grandeur of nature, but there's often a very unique voice that begins to speak in the midst of nature. What the psalmist calls deep calls unto deep. Being surrounded by nature often speaks loudly to the inner life of a naturalist in ways that few other things can. As we become small, we realize how big God is and how much He does to protect and take care of us. This is God's point in Job 37. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you go, and no further, and here your proud waves will be stayed. Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place? Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know all this. Where is the way to the dwelling of light, and where is the place of darkness, so that you may take it to its territory, and that you may discern the paths to its home? You know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? What is the way to the place where the light is distributed, or where the east wind is scattered upon the earth? Who has cleft a channel for the torrents of rain, and a way for the thunderbolt, to bring rain on a land where no man is, on the desert in which there is no man, to satisfy the waste and desolate land, and to make the ground sprout with grass? Do you know the ordinances of the heaven? Can you establish their rule on the earth? You see, a naturalist, as they encounter the immensity and the grandeur, begins to realize that we are small, and God is immense, and we cannot control most of nature. But nature obeys God joyfully, and so we respond in humility and submission. Often we encounter incredible beauty when we are in nature. If creation is beautiful, it points to the goodness of the Creator. If God lavishly gives much more beauty than we can ever absorb, then we can trust God to take care of us. We also often experience very unique joy while we are in creation. And each person often is uniquely affected by creation. What you might want to do is take some of the creation psalms that I have listed here, 8, 19, 29, 65, 104, 139, to help you in being able to see God's perspective about His creation. One danger that you might want to be aware of is that it is possible to start to worship the creation rather than the Creator. And our perspective really does matter. And so while you are out enjoying creation, try to look at it through the eyes of God. Remember that it leads back to God. It's a good practice to maybe take some of the Psalms that we have talked about with you while you're out there. Memorize certain passages of Scripture and have that in your mind as you are in creation. It's a wonderful thing often to be praying and direct your heart towards God. If you find that you're vulnerable to creation worship, a corrective might be to immerse yourself in many other forms of worship so that you can begin to feel the difference between worship and idolatry. And you may want to pray the Psalms, sing the hymns, worship songs, and absorb other worship materials that move you towards adoration. It's also helpful to worship in community often so that you have modeled for you what real worship is all about. I encourage you to take some time to enjoy this pathway of nature, and a few suggestions. If you find that it's taking you into a state of closeness with God, then I'd encourage you to regularly schedule time in nature. There have been studies that have shown that when you spend time in nature, it often cures depression. And it often is a very, very, it's a time that rebuilds in ways that you can't possibly imagine. And so make sure that you take that time. You may want to think about David's life and how often God put him in the school of nature. He learned to know God and be a man after God's own heart. Is it possible that he learned that by the many hours that he spent in nature communing with God? Or think about how often Jesus spent time in nature. He didn't have a home. He slept under the stars, from what we understand, most of the time. And notice how often he taught us in the things that he taught to pay attention to birds, to the grass, and to the flowers, and how often nature becomes a major part of his teaching. It's also helpful to think about your own process of creativity. Sometimes spending time in creation can inspire you to create. And Gary Thomas says, healthy Christians create. It is the nature of our God to create. He's introduced in Genesis 1 as the creator of everything. One of the last images given to us in the book of Revelation is God creating the new heaven and the new earth. The Bible is literally framed around the act of God creating. Being immersed in this whole idea of creation can be very healing and very healthy. May God bless you as you take time this week and in the future to immerse yourself in worshiping God in creation. I got so involved that it turned into much longer than 5 minutes, but thank you.